I'm Rashonda Harris. Welcome to the NCURA 2021 webinar series on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today's webinar is on allyship. We have some special panelists with us today that will share a wealth of information for you. Let me just introduce them. First, I have Bonnie Jean Zitsky from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Next, I have Marshawn Jackson from the University of Maryland, College Park. And finally, I have David Schultz from the University of Houston. I am so excited about today's program. Let me provide you with a brief overview. Bonnie Jean will be covering be empathetic, awareness, and listening. Marshawn will go into show up, be accountable, and be supportive. David will wrap things up with advocate, speak up, set the tone, and plan to act. Bonnie Jean, would you like to start?
Thank you, Rashonda. Thank you so much for having us in this panel today. We would like to start with a quick TikTok, actually, that may evoke strong emotions. And so we have that quick warning content that was up there for a minute. And here we go. Shoot, we can't hear it.
Reason why racism is alive and well today.
Okay, here we go.
Something that white people aren't ready to hear.
White people who are not racist are the reason why racism is alive and well today. You've learned to normalize racism because chances are your grandparents or parents or siblings, cousins, uncles, someone in your family is racist. You have friends that are racist, co-workers who will confide their racist thoughts to you in the absence of people of color. And while you may not agree with them, you've learned to agree to disagree. You wouldn't agree to disagree about child pornography or domestic violence or harm to domestic pets, but you've learned to do that with racism and love them still. It's no surprise that you're willing to vote for someone who's racist because you've learned to basically accept people. Some of you will even marry them, all while calling yourself an ally, not realizing that you're emboldening them, complicit in your silence and your tolerance. If a racist confides in you, you're their safe space.
So we thought this would be a great video to start off with. True active allyship requires us to get uncomfortable, to be vulnerable, and I'm sure that's what some of us are feeling right now. Next up, we have an interactive poll. So if you could click on this link or enter the link into a web browser, it'll take you to a very brief question. We don't have the opportunity to reflect on that video in small groups or large groups, so we thought we might ask you how this made you feel. If you click on that link, you'll be able to anonymously place a little marker on one of these feelings. And while you're doing that, I'll just share that I know 100% that 6 years ago, this video would have evoked a much different response in my own self than it does today. So I mark 6 years as kind of the start of my anti-racist allyship journey. And I know, because I've thought about this a lot, that 6 years ago, had I seen this, I would have felt defensive. I would have, considered myself a good white liberal who treats everyone equally and doesn't see color. And so certainly seeing something like this, I would have felt a little nervous and anxious about it and confused. Today, after significant work of my own white anti-racist identity development, I feel differently. I feel empowered. I feel that this man is speaking the truth that many of us need to hear. And that's not just because I watched a few webinars, read a few books. That's like deep 6 years of work in myself in understanding where we are today and what we need to do to dismantle some of these systems. So thanks to those of you who are brave enough to log on and mark how you're feeling. I think that's an important part of this. Looks like many people are concerned. Some feel empowered. We have a lot of different other responses. That's great. Other positive responses. Maybe a negative response or two, a defensive response or two. Thank you for sharing, and some that feel seen, which is the purpose of this entire allyship webinar. So thank you for sharing. Let's continue to engage in this conversation. Sit in your discomfort, understand that we're here to talk about a much larger picture. Know what your boundaries are, know what you can talk about, what you can engage in, and when you just have to sit and listen, because that's going to be the most positive outcome for you and for others in this conversation. So allyship. When I was first invited to present on this panel, I thought, okay, I know what allyship is. My son is a fourth grader in a bilingual Spanish immersion school, and his school is always talking about allyship. When he leaves for school in the morning, one of the things my husband and I say to him is, be a good ally, because he knows what that means. His school knows what that means. I have huge posters about allyship. But I thought, what do others think this means? And what do others who I view as inclusive leaders within my institution, what do they think? So I sent out an email, a very informal email survey to many people, not just within my own institution, but within NCURA, folks who I see creating inclusive environments for others intentionally. And I wondered, what does allyship mean to them? I heard all sorts of responses from I've never heard of it to I strongly identify with it. And when I told my 9-year-old that this big boss at my institution had never heard of allyship, his little white mind was blown, which was kind of cool because he is the future and he already is grounded in this language. But there are people who haven't heard of that. A theme was allyship over ally because allyship indicates an active responsibility. Some people who hadn't heard of it said, I guess it might have to do with mentorship or partnership, advocating for others who aren't at the table, finding a way to get other voices at the table. It's not a cheering section, it's actually doing the work. It's listening more than you speak and creating environments in which others can thrive. There were a couple critiques of this word allyship. One person brought up that, you know, an ally, if you think of it in terms of like warfare, ally means somebody who's on your side. So picking sides, which I think can be seen as a good thing. When you think about people who said there are good people on both sides, maybe sometimes there aren't. But in general, rather than creating a division, thinking of how we can bring people together, maybe when picking sides or winning isn't the right type of language that will resonate with some people. And then one thing that I thought was so interesting, somebody responded and said, we don't get to call ourselves allies. Those whom we are attempting to support get to identify us as allies. So it's something that we can work towards, but others identify us as. I thought that was interesting. So another important thing whenever having a conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, I think, is stating your positionality, identifying not only for yourself, but those with whom you're having this conversation, who you are and where you're coming from. So I am a straight, cisgendered white woman who is a mom and a wife. I just received my master's degree in educational leadership and policy analysis. The curriculum was grounded in anti-racist theory. And so when I talk about allyship, a lot of my language and my experience is coming from that perspective. My capstone was written about how research administrators can serve as anti-racists. I also identify as a research administrator. So I think knowing that when I'm having this conversation with you all, I am coming from that perspective, knowing that allyship is a much larger word, and allyship can be used in a variety of settings, including when you're supporting any group that's marginalized or minoritized. So women, people of color, people with disabilities in many different areas, those who identify LGBTQIA. You can be an ally to many different groups. When I'm talking about it in this session, I'm mostly talking about anti-racist work because that's my background and my perspective. So I came up with this definition of allyship after reading all of those others. I had my own definition, and then reaching out and hearing what others thought, I tweaked it a little bit. And I consider allyship really the act of using one's positionality and the resources at their disposal to create space for others to flourish and thrive and do their best work. Allyship is a goal for which one should be continuously striving, understanding that it's not their responsibility to decide if and when they've been successful. And allyship is not externally rewarded. It's not like you get to wear an ally pin on your bag and then get a free cookie whenever you go to a coffee shop. Like, this is something that is tough, it's hard work, and it's something that you might never know if you're being successful as an ally. It's for others really to judge. So in talking about empathy, I think we talk about empathy because empathy is really the first step towards allyship. But before we even get to empathy, I think we need to talk about self-awareness or identity development, which I talked about a little bit before. And in talking about identity development, I think we need to, especially when you talk about racial identity development and white anti-racist identity development, we need to talk about critical race theory a little bit. And that's something that's become a hot topic across the nation. And it's something that a lot of people don't understand and don't know what it means. Critical race theory is not suggesting that one feels guilty or shameful about who they are, specifically because they're white. Critical race theory gives us the tools to talk about how, as a white person, I participate in structures every day. I'm incentivized to participate in these structures that benefit me. And so understanding that it's my role to dismantle those structures and to tear down those structures. I think we're still on the last slide. Sorry if I kind of strayed a little bit. But so it's important, and for those who are out there who might be interested in this idea of a white racial identity development, there are a couple people, I should have put this on the slide, but Janet Helms is a researcher who dove into white identity development, and then also there's Rowe, Bennett, and Atkinson who talk about white racial consciousness. And so it's moving from, well, white supremacy, really, and moving through stages to understand what our role is in the system that was created, the society that was created with various systems, for example, housing and redlining, and how that really was set up to benefit white people. The after World War II, and that the act that was set up for veterans to provide them with money to attend school. Many schools were only accepting white people at the time and white scholars. And so there are these systems that have been set up to really benefit white people throughout history. Education is another huge one. So knowing that, you know, even though I, as myself, I've never owned anyone, I'm not closely at all related to a slave owner. That's not what critical race theory is about. It's about understanding these structures within our society, how they're created to benefit me, and how I can work towards tearing down those structures to create space to lift others up. It's a very simplified way of describing a very complex theory, but one that's helpful that we learn about as we discuss these issues. So understanding who you are helps you be empathetic towards others who weren't part of those systems, who weren't part, they weren't intended to be benefited by many of these systems. This can also, although I'm talking about it in a racialized context, for sure, people who identify as gay or transgender, or even women they were also some of those structures, education, housing, and healthcare. That's the other big one that I forgot to mention. But those are systems that have been created over centuries to benefit certain people. And so as an ally, it's your job to use your positionality and power within those structures to create space to lift others up. Okay. So, and then another important piece is understanding what your role is and what the expectation of you is. So sometimes the expectation as an ally is to use your role at the table to create that space so others can be successful. Sometimes it's your expectation is that you will step away from the table so others can come into that space and have a seat at the table. Again, talking about allyship is uncomfortable. It requires you to continue to grow, to continue. I mentioned before, you're not going to learn this from reading a book or attending a webinar. However, you will continue to grow by reading books and attending webinars. Like it's compounding the knowledge that you have when you attend sessions like this and you hear about a book or a theory that you might want to look into and do more work on. So committing to that continued growth is an important piece of being an ally, as well as committing to being uncomfortable and having those conversations. And then in my last slide, I want to talk about this idea of tempered radicals. So this is an idea I came upon in some of my research. And what a tempered radical is someone who uses their positionality in a position that holds power to affect change. And so it's really allyship through positionality and influencing through power. So because I have a seat at the table at my institution in a leadership role, I might be able to start planting different ideas about how we can become, how we can, this is one thing I am doing, is looking at how we can revise our policies to support equity and specifically anti-racist policies. So when we look at, you know, how we give out subawards and if those subawards are being given to small organizations that may not have the audit background or financial statements to support what we might normally expect of a subrecipient. Perhaps it's because that subrecipient hasn't had the opportunity to gain those experiences or what we might, those things that we usually expect from a subrecipient. Normally we might just say no, but if we're looking at it through an anti-racist lens and saying, well, why hasn't this organization been in a position to have a robust financial statement? And what is the mission of the program that's supporting this subrecipient? And is it a benefit to bring this person on board? Then maybe we can adjust our policies and our guidance a little bit to make room to support those organizations. So that's one way I can think of being a tempered radical practically in our work as research administrators. But it can happen wherever you are, in whatever space you are in, if you hold power, kind of using that positionality to plant ideas and plant seeds without getting yourself kicked out of the room. So that's where the tempered part comes in. And so without constantly being the person who's talking about, you know, racism and oppression and all of these things, which I really have to check myself on, because sometimes I think that's not right. I think like I should be able to come and share everything I've learned about this new book I read, and like we want to, you know, take over the entire leadership team meeting talking about how we can all be better allies to people of color in our office. But that's not what folks want to hear. And if I was continually doing that, they would probably be like, what? Get her out. Like, we don't want to talk about this, which I hate. I hate that. I wish, you know, it could be both ways. So I have to remember, you know, okay, temper these expectations and what you think you can achieve. I work in a predominantly white institution, grounded in policies and procedures and tradition from over the past 170 years. I think many of you can probably relate. So temper my expectations about what I think I can achieve. However, I have to continually be second guessing myself and saying, okay, are you not speaking up now because you're using this as an excuse? Because you're using being tempered as an excuse to not say something, or is it truly in the best interest, not of me, but of allyship in progress to not speak up now? So it's always a balance, and I see Rashonda nodding a little bit. I think she knows what I'm talking about. but it's a balance, and it's one that you have to continually do, and it's exhausting. And I know as a white lady, it's really easy for me to say that because my life is not constantly exhausting. I can step out if I want and relax. And I know that's not the position that everyone is in. So as often as I can be utilizing my allyship to create change, I'm committed to doing that. Thank you. I'm not sure if I used up the 15 minutes, so I'm not sure if we should move on to Marshawn or if there's a question.
We don't have any questions just yet, but I do have
Okay.
some that I will circle back to in the interest of time.
Great.
So I'll pick it up from here. Thanks, Bonnie Jean, for that nice introduction to our topic. And, I want to now kind of transition into how allies can actually show up and be accountable and be supportive and, do things that are actionable. And I think as a first step, we can look at the Ally Continuum. Jennifer Brown, I put the link in here, speaks more about this in detail, but basically it shows you the pathway to becoming an advocate, which I think David will talk about. And you heard Bonnie Jean kind of talk about developing that awareness. And as you can see, you start out basically with no understanding of these issues. You can show up to a training like this and say, oh, wow, they're talking about something, I didn't really think about before in the context of either my job or research administration. But that first step is really just developing the awareness, understanding just the basic concepts, and understanding that there are privileged positions and there are people that are not in privileged positions. So I think, as a first step to this whole discussion, it really is a step of becoming more aware of where you are on the continuum. And, just to kind of bring it into context of, what we're doing in our workplaces, diverse and inclusive workplaces can be very difficult to find and really hard to create. As Bonnie Jean was speaking, most of us work at predominantly white institutions. So if you really care about making your workplace diverse and truly inclusive, you have the ability to affect change by moving along this ally continuum. And, just to reiterate what Bonnie Jean was saying, an ally is someone who is not a member of the underrepresented group, but who takes actions to support this group. So, one major step is just becoming aware of what voices or what groups of people in your departments, your teams, who are not in the majority. And, their voices may not be getting heard, but you may not be aware of it because that may not be something that, is the first thing you think of when you're doing your day-to-day tasks for, research administration work. But it's up to people who hold positions of privilege to be active allies to those with less access, and to really take responsibility for making changes that will help others be successful. And active allies utilize their credibility to create a more inclusive workplace where everyone can thrive. And they find ways to make their privilege work for others. So this active stage is really what, I'm talking about in my portion of the discussion, but this is where you really see the impacts of allyship and the beginnings of allies becoming an advocate as well. So I do think this continuum is really important, just for you to develop some awareness of where you may be, or people that you may consider to be an ally. Next slide, please. So here, we really want to get into, on the continuum, what can active allyship look like, and what really does it look like? And I just put some bullets here of things that, from my experience, my position as a Black male, cisgender, heterosexual, that I've experienced in the workplace, in the 25 years I've been, in the work world. But the first thing I put on here is talk about the expertise you see in others, publicly and privately. I really benefited tremendously in the beginning of my career by having people advocate for me in this way. Just simply talking about, hey, I think this guy over here can help you in this area. Why don't you assign this task to him? Or even better, recommend them for the actual assignment or learning opportunities to be more visible in the organization. A lot of times the underrepresented groups just simply do not have the access or voice to get these opportunities. And it may not be because of who they are. It's just when you're in the minority group or in, the underrepresented group, you don't have the access to networks, to privilege that can really put you in the pathway to get these assignments. So, an active ally would definitely share a colleague's career goals with influencers on your campus or your organization, but they're thinking about pulling those groups in to get opportunities. Um, that fourth bullet, I think, is a really simple one people can do too. I've seen that really drive big dividends for different people. Um, Inviting them to speak at a staff meeting. I mean, that's really, really simple. But I can remember in the beginning of my career, I had extreme anxiety in speaking, in front of groups of people where I'm the only Black person in the room. So, that's really anxiety inducing. And at the same time, you kind of want to shrink away from being visible in those settings. So sometimes getting that invitation to speak or asking someone before the meeting, prompting them like, hey, you mind if I bounce this to you? I mean, those are really simple things that you can do, but it does give the underrepresented group an opportunity that they may not feel is in their best interest to do. So, that's really a positive way an ally can actively support someone in that way. And then I put on here these next three, I think, are all kind of correlated, but there are other ways that you can take it like another step, and that's kind of almost putting yourself out there a little bit, a less passive way. Maybe offering to co-present. We're all presenting on this panel together. We're all from different backgrounds, and we have different levels of privilege, but we're all collaborating, we're all working together. And that gives some people watching this presentation the idea that, hey, maybe I can do that too. But also it gives people, access to be able to present their ideas, give them opportunities for advancement, thinking that, they can contribute to the overall field of research administration in a way that they may not have considered before. So I do think, that is something that will move you along that continuum a little bit more. But, that the next one I haven't read there at the bottom is one that I've personally experienced, and I know for a fact is very powerful. If you witness behavior or speech that is degrading or offensive to underrepresented groups, say something. Just don't, take it in and be like, oh, that's, shocking. But I did that. And if you're unaware in that first stage, like I have been, I didn't realize, even as a Black male, I have privilege. I'm a man. So I've heard, very derogatory comments about people that were not men and didn't say anything. And I had to check myself about that because, I have many, many women that I love and adore, but at the same time, just wasn't aware of that privilege in a way that I thought could make a difference, but it does. Um, and I've been very conscious of that as, my role as a director at my institution. So I definitely think it's important to create safe spaces for people and not allow language or conversations that may push people out. I think that can be very destructive and opposite of inclusive. So allies definitely have to work their way up to, being actively defending the underrepresented group when something like that can occur in any situation. So that last bullet is just kind of summing up this whole slide, which is if you're actively seeking out marginalized voices and perspectives, then you're moving along that continuum. You're becoming more and more of an advocate, and you are developing that resilience to really be an active ally. Next slide. So in this stage, active accountability, there's a couple things that I think, can just be some good reminders for you all if you're trying to, lead this conversation and say, okay, I think I'm aware, but how do I, move to this active stage? So I just put some really simple things here. Find a way for everyone to succeed and thrive. If you are in a position of leadership, if you're, a lead, you don't have to be a director, an assistant director. You could just be, a lower level manager. Just find a way for your team to be inclusive and think about all the things that we're presenting in this scenario. You really do have a lot of power that you may not even be aware of. Don't get caught up in the zero sum scenarios. A lot of people say, well, if you help this person, now you got to help the other 29 people in your group. Equity doesn't quite work that way. You just meet each person where they are, based on their privilege, based on their, understanding of research administration, based on, their background. So every person has a different need for support from an ally. So don't get caught up in trying to make sure everything is completely equal. It won't happen, and you'll end up, not being an ally, because that really isn't equity in a sense. Realizing that you can use your positional, political, or social power in a good way. I think sometimes we can get caught up in our institutions, especially, us bigger schools. It's very political. There's a lot of what I call Game of Thrones or kingdoms, where everybody's trying to, strategize how to get more resources or whatever. But you can use a little bit of that power for good. You can definitely, support a DEI initiative. You can bring in people that haven't had training opportunities, send them to a program like this. Think about training opportunities in your campus community, putting people out there just so they're more visible. But you do have power if you are in a privileged group. And that is really, really critical for you to do in this active stage, because if you have all this power and you don't use it, you're really not an ally. You're kind of just sitting in that awareness stage, but you're not actively doing anything about it. So that can actually hurt a lot of people, because they need people to support the whole team. And I put well-informed, sharing, seeking diversity. And then this last thing is what I really want to, reemphasize before moving on is, if you're in the active stage, you may not be doing it proactively. And that's really that last kind of hump you have to get over with allyship. It doesn't mean that you have to wait for all these scenarios to happen, like someone says something negative, or someone, you can see they're not speaking in a meeting. Think about it ahead of time. You already know who's on your teams. You know the environment on your campus or in your organization. So there are proactive ways that you can actually become an advocate, and that is moving out of that active stage where you're really proactively attacking racist behavior, sexist behavior, classist behavior. It just becomes part of your leadership and management style, which makes you a true ally for your team and whoever works for you or works with you in your organization. But that's a really hard stage to get to, and it does take work, because being proactive, like this seminar, this is an example of it. we're not doing this in reaction to something. We're doing it because it's good input, and it's hopefully going to change a couple minds out there around how they approach allyship and different DEI initiatives. So I really want to reemphasize that as a key component of the active stage.
Marshawn, while
So,
we are going into your poll, if you could just go clarify just a bit further, because you made a great point about equity versus equality. And I think that if you could go a little bit more into it as you talk about this, that would be great.
yeah, no, that's a great question. I did another webinar on this, and the example I give with equity and equality is everyone comes and they don't have any shoes. You say, okay, well, everybody needs a pair of shoes. So you go out and buy all size. I wear a size 11. So everybody gets a size 11 pair of gym shoes. But the reality is everyone doesn't wear a size 11. So you got to go out and figure out, okay, he wears a size 5, they wear a size 2, they wear a size 8. You have to meet people where they are, and you have to give them the shoe that fits. And in some cases, people already own shoes, so they don't need anything. They come in, they're not barefoot, but everyone has to um, be met where they are, if that clarifies it a little bit. I think it's easy to get caught up in saying, well, we want equality because that was one of the slogans definitely during the civil rights era, which is we want everyone to be equal. But I think what we've realized over time is that equality does not equal fairness. And I think that's what equity kind of addresses is, yeah, everyone needs shoes, but you need shoes that fit. Otherwise, they're going to be flopping off or they don't fit at all. So what good is it for everyone to just get a pair of shoes?
I think that was a great explanation on equity versus equality. Thank you, Marshawn.
So I think we had a poll. I think everyone took it here. So we wanted to see where you all were on the Ally Continuum. And I think this is a very honest poll result. I think a lot of people, especially attending this, are definitely aware. You probably wouldn't have signed up if you weren't aware this is something that's important. And, I wouldn't expect people on here to be apathetic. So I definitely think that shows that you all are a very aware group of people. And what we're trying to do in this webinar is kind of push you along down that continuum to be in the active stage. And then we'll talk a little bit more about being an advocate and being more proactive in your approach. So this is a really nice graphic of generally where people are. So this last slide I just wanted to bring up really quickly. I think we spend a lot of time talking from the perspective of the dominant group, which is, okay, how can I be an ally? And those are usually the positions of privilege. So we're speaking from that lens. But this slide, I wanted to just quickly say, okay, you're on the other end of that. Now you're someone that's looking for an ally. You're in that underrepresented group. What can you do? And I give a personal example. I first found out about formal networks of allies when I was in college. I was working and I just saw a flyer, and it was for this program called Inroads. And what they did is they took underrepresented groups in college and they hooked them up with companies, and then they gave them internships. But in order to do that, you had to attend a bunch of classes, they had trainings, you had webinars. So there was some work attached to it. But by the time I got to my fourth year, my senior year in college, I had already had an internship. And I know for a fact I would not have had an internship if I did not join that group. None of my friends had internships. And they all asked me, like, how did you do that? And I'm like, well, I spent the past 3 years being part of this formal group. It was a lot of work. I had spent my summers, working for free, basically. But it put me on a path to have an opportunity. I know for a fact it would not have been there, just by the sheer fact of the people around me who didn't get those opportunities. So you do need to think about it if you are someone out there looking for an ally. there are formal networks. Even at this stage of your career or in life, you can do different things. I'd say organizations like NCURA, SRA, they have formal networks inside the organizations where you can seek out allies. And, there's other research administration groups that even within those, they're allies. And as I think DEI becomes more universal and people recognize the need to address it, there will be more and more pathways for people to find allyship within these formal organizations. So I would just say keep an eye on the lookout for people that appear to have allyship as a concern of theirs within these formal groups. And then I think too, there's informal networks, and this is really just from people who are plugged into connected other formal networks, or you just know this individual as someone is connected to a lot of different people. And you can network with those people because sometimes they can put you in contact with opportunities or groups that you can outreach to and find out ways that you can find some allyship and get help with whatever barriers that you're experiencing in your work or your job. If it's from how do I get to the next level in my job, to I'm having problems with my cost model, or if I'm having problems my effort reports. If you feel like you don't have the support, allies are there to help, but you do have to seek them out a little bit harder in the informal networks. And then this other one I put on here is I think sometimes, at least from my perspective in the beginning when I started working, I was looking for people with leadership titles. I was looking for that AVP, that VP as the person to be the ally. Many times it's really not the person with the fancy title. A lot of times it could just be a person with a lower level title, but they are very connected and they understand the networks and the organizations. In our institution, I quickly realized when I got to Maryland, a lot of the key allies were people that were, what we would consider secretaries or people that were previously graduate students at the institution and then continued to work there for 20 years. And they had tons of institutional knowledge. They knew wherever you needed to go to get some help, but they could have been overlooked because they didn't have a director or VP or some fancy title attached to their name. So I would say really focus on people who have connections, that understand the networks. And again, they have signaled to you that they are interested in allyship. And then just the last one on here is, become one. I think sometimes allies are important in terms of providing help, but if you don't have any network or you can't find anyone, you probably can help someone else. Even, if you're in a underrepresented group, you still may be in a position to be an ally to someone else. And if you can build that network, that's just the first step. You have someone that you can bounce ideas off of or help, and that brings tremendous benefits to you. But also it keeps enforcing the idea in whatever organization you're in that we're also here to help other people besides just extending our career aspirations. So that is the last one I wanted to point out there. And I'll turn
As
it
we
over
move
to
into
David.
as we move into David's section, I just wanted to mention that you made some really good points, and that it's really important to remember that leadership is a state of mind, not a position. And so people who are very well connected don't often have the title leadership because of that same reason.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Marshawn. I'm going to try to tie all this good information from Bonnie, Jean, and Marshawn up as we kind of look to the final phase of the continuum, which is obviously the position to which you advocate. So we're going to cover what is an advocate, right? So when you think about an advocate, what makes someone an advocate, right? I mean, we talk about allyship, we talk about people in positions, we talk about leadership, non-leadership roles. I think from my perspective, the advocate is someone who takes that next step They recognize the position that they're in. They recognize their ability to influence people, their ability to kind of shape processes, to bring those individuals who aren't necessarily part of those committees or those discussions or those task groups or those focus groups. And they bring them into that area. They kind of pave the way. I obviously, as a white male, do sit in a position of privilege, and I recognize that. And I not only feel that it's incumbent upon me morally or ethically, but even personally, because again, people have to make that decision. Bonnie Jean talked about her path in the past 6 years and how she's come to the position where she is and her personal beliefs. For me, I really do see a responsibility to make sure that my actions reflect my behaviors, my mindset, the way that I perceive things. And I really take on that position to not only create opportunities, but when you talk about putting people on a position or you put them on a group, do you do that because it looks good? Do you do that because it gives you the optics that, hey, look at me, I'm helping people out? It's not really that. I mean, this is, from my perspective, it's a partnership, right? I mean, I've been very fortunate in my career to sit in a position where I can shape policy and I can form committees, but I also have a vested interest in my staff as individuals. You talk about getting to know people. Marshawn talked about, recognizing skills within individuals. One of the things that I look at is, trying to understand a person where they are. Not everybody wants to be like me when they grow up. Some people are very comfortable where they are, and that's a hard thing for me to understand. Not everybody wants to be a manager. They don't want the job. They don't want the responsibility. Some people are comfortable with where they are, but it doesn't mean that they don't need to be sitting at the table, right? They still need a seat. They still need a voice. They still need an opportunity to be a part of that process. And I think a lot of leaders have to reflect on that and say, it's not necessarily having the people who have the largest voice. I am very forthright in my role that I sit in. I'm not the best person to make decisions. Ultimately, I am tasked with making a decision, but do I bring the people that are closest to the work? Do I bring the people that actually engage on a day-to-day task? Do they have opportunity for buy-in to help shape that process? And I think to me, that's where a lot of people miss out on that. And as an advocate, you really look to bring not only marginalized people, but people who just in essence aren't part of that sit-down group. And again, it could be based on race, it could be based, on gender, it could be based on anything, disabilities. I mean, have you ever seen somebody try to struggle to walk into a building? Well, what do you do to try to shape that? Do you go to your supervisor and say, why don't we have this opportunity? Or, I saw someone struggling to get into the building. What can I do as an individual or a member of a university community to ensure that that doesn't happen in the future, right? So that's really where, from my opinion, where the rubber hits the road and you kind of start putting these things into motion and into action. And I think it really starts with, speaking up. Again, in a position of privilege, you really have a responsibility to promote and to advocate for policies. What does our hiring process look like? Why is it that everyone in an office seems to look like me? Does anybody even recognize that that's problematic? I think people often reference the fact that you have a bunch of white males making decisions on women's rights. That's kind of something people look at and say, well, are they in the best position to make, healthcare policy decisions? Well, no, they're not, right? But again, as an advocate, people speak up on that. That's why you see people out there expressing their rights and their opinions and trying to make change here, because they're really trying to make those policies different. They're trying to make inroads into these things. I think the one thing that people often struggle with is, understanding that you as an individual really have the power to make impactful change. As Marshawn indicated, you hear a joke or you hear someone talk about something that you don't agree with. Well, I think a lot of times people struggle to say, well, I'm not going to associate with those people because that's not who I am. I don't identify with them. Well, me not associating with them doesn't mean I actually made an opportunity to change that behavior. Did I openly speak out and say, you know what, I don't appreciate that comment, and quite frankly, I don't think this is the area that would appreciate you repeating things like that. Do you go above and beyond? Bonnie Jean talked about it, getting outside of your comfort zone, right? And I think that's what a lot of people struggle with is, what is my latitude of comfort? What is my ability to challenge myself to be uncomfortable? It's not for everyone, but again, this is a journey. I think it starts with a decision for oneself to really make that conscious effort that you go above and beyond and out of your way to not just sit there in complacency. Because again, if you're complacent, I think to the video's perspective, if you're not challenging those people, if you're not re-emphasizing that this is not appropriate behavior, well, then in essence, you're really just a bystander, right? And they're not going to change their behaviors. Which I think kind of goes to the third, bullet point of really, confronting actions to try to repeat those things from happening. We've all been there, right? You're sitting at a gathering, somebody makes an inappropriate comment, a couple of people get up and leave the table, everybody kind of, half-heartedly laughs and they go, well, that's just how they are. Well, you kind of would expect things like that from them. Who actually has the courage to stand up and say, you know what, I don't think that that's the type of thing that we should tolerate here, or I think you should leave. I think people are more apt to take, the higher road, in essence, if you want to call it that, and remove themselves from a circumstance instead of removing that person from the circumstance. And I think that's really, from my perspective, where you see this opportunity to speak up and to be empowered. And I'm very pleased that we see more people taking that opportunity to speak up and to make sure that their voice is heard. Kind of the fourth bullet point, becoming a voice for others or providing a platform. I think that this is something that I recognize in myself. I am not an introvert, for those of you that know me. I feel very comfortable in crowds. I don't have a fear of public speaking, but I also understand that not everybody is that way, right? I have taken very calculated opportunities to help people become better public speakers and to give them an opportunity. But it wasn't because I called them out in the middle of a staff meeting and said, hey, Marshawn, why don't you give us an overview of everything that you learned at your NCURA meeting? Well, because if Marshawn doesn't feel comfortable doing that, well, then I didn't really help him, in essence, right? I think I'm helping him, but what I've done is I've actually further pushed him back and separated him from his normalcy there. So I think, you have to understand people, understand what they're comfortable with, and maybe you take the opportunity to do that. I had a young lady that I supervised previously who had a very bad fear of public speaking. And I asked her, well, why don't you just talk to the group of 2 minutes about your favorite ice cream? She said, well, that's ridiculous, David. I said, yeah, but you're comfortable with it. It's not something you'd be challenged by. You have an opportunity to do that. We went through several staff meetings to the point where we got to more aggressive topics, right? But I slowly kind of brought her into that comfort zone. And I think that's what you have to do sometimes, is you have to create a platform for those who aren't necessarily comfortable in that area. Setting the tone, Marshawn talked about the fact that you don't have to be in a position of leadership to do this. And I'm impressed by everyone that I engage with at universities. I've been at 4 universities. They're drastically different. But I think setting the tone really comes from the ability to create a safe space for discussion. This is something that we heard in a discussion group at the national meeting, is, do people like myself, let's just say a white male, do we feel comfortable coming to a group of individuals and saying, you know what, I don't really understand this. What is critical race theory? What does it mean to have white privilege? Have we really overcome our fear to be able to come to a space and ask those really tough questions? Because again, remember where it starts, right? It starts with educating, right? When we go back to this continuum, you have to admit your own ignorance, and you have to be able to, want to seek that information out. And as an active learner, I think you have to also find the individuals that understand that you are wanting to learn, that you're not trying to engage in counterproductive activities or push back on these things. You don't know what you don't know. And some people don't have that space or ability or colleague to help them grow into the knowledge that they need to really be an ally or an advocate in these things. And, again, to Bonnie Jean's point, this is something that is continued growth. You can't just wake up one day and say, well, I've read the articles, I attended, the Allyship, NCURA webinar. I went and got my certification from the University of Central Florida. So, I'm good now, right? Everybody, can see that on there. It's on my LinkedIn page. That's not really what it's about. It's about making sure that people continue to grow, continue to seek that knowledge, and most importantly, have colleagues and individuals that you can rally around to help keep you updated on these things and grow. And I say that from my perspective, right? Because I don't know what it's like to sit in a room full of men interviewing me that are staring at everything other than my face. I don't know what it's like for someone to say, well, maybe if you tried harder, or your opportunity will come. I can't put myself in a position where people look at the color of my skin differently or say, well, gosh, that's a really nice accent you have. You're not from around here, are you? Right? Those type of scenarios I've not experienced, but I have the ability to try to put myself in a position and to help others that have, and really become an advocate from that expense. You know, talking about setting a tone, I think, is really challenging current norms. When you go to a new institution, you realize a lot of people talk about, you know, culture or norms, and they talk about the iceberg effect, right? Where you see everything on the top, right? And to some extent, I think when you get to an institution and you have the ability to see why is it that females aren't promoted at the rate that males are? Why is there pay equity that, you know, is still in existence between similar positions on campus? Why is it that when you look at a cabinet, you see a bunch of people that don't represent the diversity that you have within other areas? You know, I think it's really challenging those current norms, asking those questions, and understanding that culture takes time to change, and you have to shape that over time. But again, you know, as someone who is an advocate, you're in that position to use your policy shaping, decision making, appointing people to these things, and you really can shape the future interactions that you have, not only within your division, but how your division is seen on campus. You know, I've seen over the course of my career a shift in terms of how the demographics are at various institutions at different levels. Well, you know, what we're seeing now is when you look at the generation of research administrators who are aging towards retirement, it's very different than the generation that's coming in. How do we create a space for them to thrive, for them to not be pigeonholed or pushed into the same mindset and mentality that we've had for the past 30 years? I think it's incumbent upon, you know, all of us to really use our position and to make sure that we, you know, kind of shape what that's going to look like.
So David, we have a question.
Sure.
And the question asks, what advice would you give for a challenge, for challenging and confronting a person in a position of authority, supervisor, parent, etc.?
You know, I think you have to understand that there may be repercussions, right? I mean, you know, if you challenge someone who's in a position of authority, then you understand that they probably will some sort of outcome in addition to that. You know, I think this slide is a great way to represent that, which is, you know, history has its eyes on you. You have to be willing to accept the fate on that, but I think at the same point, you have to have the courage to do what's right. You know, if you don't challenge that person, then not only have you let yourself down, but you've also let down all of those that are going to come behind you. Because at the end of the day, if you don't put that person in check, if you don't check yourself enough to say, you know what, right, wrong, or indifferent, I'm going to make the conscious effort that I'm going to call this out as I see it, and I'm going to make this person reflect on their actions, then that person is not going to change. And more importantly, I think then you've become complacent with that circumstance.
And David, if I may add to that as well, there's a saying that if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And I think that you made it very clear that when you make a stand, you have to be prepared for their response and to adjust your response accordingly as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, as we get onto this last slide and we talk about plan to act, you know, obviously from an advocate's perspective, you always want to be proactive. But the reason I said that this can be, you know, proactive or reactive is, as an advocate, you have to be willing to respond to something when you see it, right? If you're going to take action, if you're going to advocate for something and you see a circumstance, you have to be able to pivot to address that. And I've seen this in my current, you know, positions or areas that I've been in. I can put in a plan to make everything equitable. I can put in a plan to assign people on things. I can challenge the norms and shape the culture. But I think you also have to be willing to immediately put in a plan to make something corrective on a dime, you know, because you can't always plan and give yourself leeway to try to make inroads into certain things. Sometimes you have to be willing to do that. And I think, you know, these are kind of some of the questions that I look at when I see something like this that I'm trying to address is, you know, what is it that I'm trying to bring awareness to, right? Is this something that's related to class? Is it something that's related to structure? Is this targeted towards an individual? You know, so I think you have to kind of set parameters on what it is that you're trying to address, and then what activities are going to have the greatest impact. Is it better to take that individual and to have a conversation with them? Is it better to have an entire all hands meeting? Is it better to, you know, kind of behind the scenes, take very calculated steps to change behaviors, cultures, and norms? You know, kind of looking at the barriers to success. Is this one of those circumstances where the position of authority really is the person who is, you know, responsible for these actions? How do you do that? Are you willing to, you know, leave your position at a university and go somewhere that really does represent who you are or what you stand for, right? So, you know, what is that barrier and can it be overcome? And I think, you know, talking about that is what's the desired outcome? You know, is this something that's going to take time? Is this something that can be immediately resolved? We don't know the answer to that. And then what are the metrics that you're going to utilize? What do you gauge success as? Or is there even a metric that you can use to do that? I think Bonnie Jean kind of touched on this, but I just wanted to reemphasize this. You know, you have to do it for the cause, not the credit. You know, people who often get into performative allyship and say, oh, you know, look at me, you know, I support this action. Well, what do you do to support it? You post it on your Facebook that you have empathy for someone. That doesn't do anything, right? You've not changed any outcome. You know, you don't get a sticker. I really like that, Bonnie Jean. I say that all the time. You know, you got to put your grown-up sticker on, right? You got to act like an adult. I really like that you don't get a sticker, you know, to just put this on. You have to follow your own path and I think try to achieve whatever it is that you want. You know, a term that I think got brought up in a lot of this stuff is to be an accomplice. And I know some people look at that as kind of the negative aspect of accomplice, but to me, I think it really reemphasizes my plan, my strategy, which is however this turns out, I'm going to be right there next to you, right? Because at the end of the day, I think from my personal perspective, that's what it means is, you know, whether it's good, bad, I'm going to sit there, we're going to go through this together. You know, I won't say that it's like that final scene in Thelma and Louise, but I think it's very descriptive of where you want to be as an accomplice. You know, if it's going to go off the cliff, we're going to go off it together. So to that, Rashonda, I will defer back to you for any questions.
So I'd like to thank the panel. You guys have done an amazing job. And I would like to invite our attendees to drop questions in the chat, and I will share them with our panelists. And while I wait for that, I have a few questions that I've prepared for each of you. And so, Bonnie Jean, I would like to start with you. Your section was so it was very deep, and it was rich with a lot of good things that you can begin to get started. And so, what I wanted to know with you is how can an ally get started if they are not in a leadership position?
Well, I think allyship, I love that allyship is the final webinar of this year of the inaugural series of DEI webinars, because I really think it is the ultimate goal of this developing skills around DEI initiatives. I think in order to get started, again, it's not a leadership role that's necessary. It's understanding some of the structural issues within your institution and how you may be able to affect change in your role. So it comes from going back to that slide of identity development, empathy, and allyship. So doing the deep work of identity development. And I'm happy, I think our emails will be available. I'm happy to share any resources that I've used over the past several years. But anybody can be an ally. If you do the work and you understand your role and your positionality and the structures that are in place that are privileging some while oppressing others, and those can be very intentional, long-lasting systems like the school to prison pipeline or education and access, or they can just be the systems within your office, like who has a window desk and who sits in the middle and who, you know, who has a cubicle, like looking at these systems that are in place, understanding what kind of power you might have to affect change. Maybe it's writing a letter, maybe it's forming an EID group in your unit, maybe it's having a conversation with the manager in your office. I think the question that was posed to David in terms of how do you approach a higher level person, an example I thought of is this whole return to work thing. And I read 2 different articles about how the pressure to return to, the overall idea was the pressure to return to work is grounded in like these long-lasting traditions of like white men in power. Essentially, that's really simplifying it. But one of the articles was this lady just ranting, this white woman just ranting and swearing about why this is the patriarchy and, you know, white supremacy and blah 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 blah. And I read it and I was like, yes, this is right. But that's not the article to send to your boss or to send to the vice chancellor. There is another article I read that was an NPR story on a woman who wrote a book about essentially the same thing, that the idea of an 8 to 5 workday in one space, in one office, is really set up to benefit some and not others. And it was the same idea, just presented in a different way. And so that's the article I chose to share with some people in my circle. And so being strategic about how you are influencing or trying to influence others, I think is critical.
I think that's great, Bonnie Jean. And we had a really good panelist from one of the other sessions, Jared Kale, and he's an author. And one of his quotes, I just thought was really fitting. I just wanted to share it with you guys. It was saying that take on the struggle as your own and stand up even when you feel scared, and to transfer the benefit of your own privilege to those who lack it, and then acknowledge that while you too feel the pain, the conversation is not about you. And I think that's really what the focus should be around. And thank you for that comment. And as I move on, Marshawn, you are up next. I would like to ask you, oftentimes we hear about allyship and we immediately think about race. And as you mentioned that you could be an ally too as a Black man. So is allyship for non-white people as well? And if so, could you just explain?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And, you know, I think it almost lends to this positionality that Bonnie Jean keeps referencing, or and the other concept by Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectionality, is really important because each of us has multiple layers of what we would consider our positions or groupings in terms of how we would be labeled. So while I'm a Black man, I still have some privilege in the world. And, you know, I have to recognize that and be aware of that. But I think, you know, it's very easy for us to try to simplify um, where allyship should be placed. And, you know, that's why I tried to produce that last slide to change the lens of it, because essentially everyone should be an ally to someone else. And if you are truly in a position where you have no power at all, then, you know, you really probably aren't a research administrator, because most of us have degrees. Most of us, you know, work in nice, cushy, air-conditioned buildings or at home like we're doing now. This is a privilege. There are people that have to go into work every day on my campus, and I think Bonnie Jean's example is probably the cleanest way people can understand that concept, because, you know, there's always going to be people that are less privileged and their voices don't get heard. We've had similar complaints on our campus around, you know, telework like everyone else has. But, you know, the people that have to be on campus generally are the lower paid, service orientated employees. So in that sense, most of us could be an ally by advocating that when equity is possible, we should make sure that's, you know, something that our institutions are aware of. And again, you can only push against the powers that be so much, but a clear example would be, you know, for those groups that have to go in, maybe there should be some hazard pay, especially during COVID. Maybe they should have got a little bit more money in addition to everyone else that was being asked to come in, or maybe there should be some additional sick leave for those individuals. But, you know, these are ways to think about privilege and power in a way that doesn't solely throw it into the race bucket. And I think, you know, we have to be very aware. And the only way that's going to happen is, to continue to do webinars like these and continue that journey that Bonnie Jean and David is talking about. It takes time to really educate and internalize a lot of this information. So then you approach your job, your community, in a very different lens. So I definitely believe that anyone could be an ally in that sense. But there are definitely needs by certain groups that have to be addressed. And in our context, there are many groups that are affected, unfortunately, by their race, by their gender, by their sexuality, and we see that quite a bit. So, it is easy to understand being an ally to those groups, but you can be an ally to many, many other groups, and many other groups need it, and many different groups can be an ally.
Thank you, Marshawn. That was a great explanation on it. Very well put. David, can you share with me what is the importance of a white male as an ally to others? For example, there's lots to talk about, as Bonnie Jean mentioned, about the trans community, a number of other underrepresented or impacted classes that could be benefit from allyship.
Thank you, Rashonda. I think when you talk about using your position of privilege, whether that comes from being a white male or anyone in that, as a white male, I understand that people may turn to me for my input, or they may put me on a committee, or I may be a person that gets invited to provide my shape on a policy or my opinion. I think recognizing, the term, white privilege, what that means. A lot of people, I think if we did a poll on that, you'd find that there were people that would be offended or uncomfortable, or what does that mean? I like the way Bonnie Jean puts it, where you have to put in the work to educate yourself, to really do self-reflection, to really ask yourself the tough questions, and to be honest. And I think through that self-reflection, I realized that, I do have the ability to say the same thing that somebody else said in a meeting 13 times, and they go, gosh, Dave, that's a really great point. And it's sad to say that. I've witnessed that. I've worked with many females who didn't have the opportunity to be put into positions that they were qualified for, capable of, and making recommendations to say, well, I think this person would be a great fit. Okay, that's great. Next thing you know, there they go, right? I think it's recognizing the power that you have, that you didn't necessarily earn. You were given that opportunity to sit there. I can't change who I am, right? But what I am responsible for is how I use that position, what my actions can do to assist, to bring, doors opening for other individuals. Anyone who's been a member of my staff knows I will always say, if you ever want anything that I can't provide you here, I will be your biggest fan. I will write you a recommendation letter. I will reach out to that new university. Feel free to use me as a reference, right? Because if your goals and aspirations are bigger than what I can provide you, even in my own office, I'm not going to hold you back, right? Because I don't think that that is fair to the individual. So I think, to me, it's beyond just being a white male. I think that definitely provides me opportunities that others do not, and I recognize that. But I think, to Marshawn's point, is you don't have to be a white male to feel like you have the ability to help others or to bring people up. You don't necessarily know what barrier is in front of someone. So it might not necessarily be a problem that only a white male can address. It might just be having that one person that isn't necessarily in that group that you are, to help open up that opportunity, or to get you into an area that you can't get to by whatever barrier is opposing you. So.
All right, I think that was a really great explanation, and we did get a comment, and I think this is a great comment that I would like each of you to see if you could weigh in on. And what the comment said is that the problem of minorities standing up for him or herself is that sometimes you're scared that you might get fired or lose your job. And as many of you are aware, the pandemic is a great example of how many frontline workers were exposed to COVID because they had no other choice than to disregard their own safety and to try to get out to not to lose their jobs. So could each of you speak to that, please?
I think that's a tough position to be in, and that's where allyship can be effective, because those who are so terrified to speak up, that because the result is losing their job, that's a huge consequence of speaking up. Finding allies in that role, and I hate to even put it on those folks, it's others in positions of power, should be identifying as an ally and seeing, wait, I mean, Marshawn just spoke to it with the low-wage workers or service workers who are coming onto campus continually. How can those in administration roles of an institution use their position to advocate, as the word that David used, I like that word, to advocate for those folks who are too scared to do so? As Marshawn was speaking about those folks who are in positions in which they don't have privilege, I thought about standpoint theory, which is another resource I should have put on the slide, but it's the idea that those, as your levels of privilege increase, your take on reality decreases. So those with more levels of privilege aren't truly seeing what is, and those with more levels of oppression do see what is. They see the truth. So that's where this author, I learned this on the Seen on Radio podcast, Seeing White, and the host said that's why I've always listened to Black women in general, because they have those two levels of oppression applied to them in daily society, and it's likely they are seeing what is, like, the reality of a situation and experiencing it more truthfully than those who are two levels of privilege removed. And so that's why it's critical that those folks are using their power to influence decisions that are affecting the people who aren't at the table making the decisions.
Thank you, Bonnie Jean.
And I guess just to quickly add to what she said, I agree with everything you said. I would say, from a person who has been in the underrepresented group my whole life, you need to be strategic. It's the same as, what Bonnie Jean was saying. You have to choose what type of article you're sending to your leadership. So there's different ways to push against the system, and there's different ways to address inequity. But ultimately, the way I look at it, I'm beholden to no one when they're being inequitable. So if it's a bad relationship, you should move on. But if it is something that you feel like can change through education, then I would take a strategic approach to address the inequity. But the framing of the question is kind of upside down. That's why I kind of like Bonnie Jean's response. The real question is, why isn't it okay for you to say something wherever you are? I don't know what institution you're at. So there has to be pathways for people to share their concerns, feel like they're being heard. And if your institutional organization is, having DEI initiatives on your campus, then I would try to use those channels to get that conversation started. Because, you shouldn't have to fear losing your job to basically put out a concern about, your general well-being or career. And if you're in that position, again, I would just think strategically of whether or not that's a good fit for you. If you can't even voice your concern over your job.
Thank you, Marshawn. And David, in the interest of time, I'm going to actually begin to wrap up. And I want to thank you guys for your just amazing contributions today. It's been really a good session. There was one final comment that I wanted to address, and it said that, as the only one working in my home during the pandemic, I felt like I had to hide my physical disability. And that is, something that is also another reason why, you know, we have concerns about, you know, being equitable and ensuring that, you know, there's just not one size that fits all, because as Marshawn mentioned, you know, equity versus equality, you know, it's important to make sure that not only that I have shoes on, but that they fit. And so as we continue to move on, I would like to offer any closing remarks by any of you. Wanted to say anything else? Well, David, since I did end with you.
You know, I think just to kind of, from my own perspective, it's important to know where you are, and it's important to be honest with yourself about where you want to get to. It's not about checking boxes or being part of something. I think it's really about achieving your own self journey, and you have to basically figure out whether you want to be part of shaping this for other individuals who don't sit in positions that you are, or whether you are complacent and comfortable just taking the free ride. And you know, nobody can answer that for you. I think it is you know, something that you have to decide as an individual. And once you make that decision, you know, you know, again, just to kind of reiterate what Bonnie Jean said, it really is a lifelong decision. You never really reach your goal, because when you get to the goal that you have, you should be smart enough to set that goal and have higher expectations for yourself to help those around you.
I agree. And to also to your point, I just wanted to add, there's a book that I've read, and I love this book so much that I've read it multiple times, and I listened to the audio, and it's called The Professional Troublemaker, and it's by Lave Ajay, and I know I'm saying her name wrong, but if you look up The Professional Troublemaker, you will you'll find her. It's a great book, and what she talks about is how to get in trouble professionally, but in a good way, by doing good deeds. And it reminds me of a civil rights activist who is no longer with us, who has said good trouble, right? And I think we all know who that is. And so you know, I think about all of the things that you've said and how you've empowered people to begin their journeys into allyship and to educating themselves and to see where they can grow and become allies. I like to leave with, you know, a closing statement of one of my favorite quotes from this book is that in a world that wants us to whisper, I choose to yell. And I think that is what an ally is doing. An ally is yelling to the top of their tongues to say this is not right. I'm here to help and I want to make a difference, and they empower others. And so this has been a really good session. I thank everybody for our comments, and I want to make sure that we haven't overlooked any, and I don't see any. And so in closing, I want to thank everybody for participating.